All right. So we're going to talk about data containers for AI. And what that mean, at least is the name we put it for this week. We think that whatever is going on with MCP is just not enough, especially when you're talking about data access. So let me tell you a little bit about my background and who am I. I've been an entrepreneur for the past 20 years, spent maybe 5 years in someone else's payroll. Some of the things that I did with my companies, we got to 25 million in annual revenue. We bootstrap actually to 150 people, so no VC money. This is an e-commerce company back in Uruguay, in my home country. And then we were acquired by private equity. The other company is actually the company that got me here to the US, an image optimization solution. So very focused on performance and CDNs. We were serving about 150 countries, 10 million images processed per hour. We were also acquired by an e-commerce platform afterwards. So some of the things that I did is, can I define myself as a generalist, but I'm always focused on security and performance. A caveat on the security part is that I also contributed with the Interpol in a fraud detection once, doing forensics, testifying in front of the judge. It was weird and fun and scary. But yeah, it's super security oriented, and having worked with or servicing Fortune 50 companies, being in conversations with their CISOs, and it was always like scary conversations too to have. And something that you think as an engineer generally is you work with these companies, they're going to be very mature. They're going to have a lot of processes. They're going to have a lot of problems well solved. When actually you're looking at very legacy systems of record, things that are not state of the art and not standard to what we are seeing today and in modern environments, right? And platforms. So you need to adapt that too. And I also work with all these frameworks that you see here. The funny story with PCI DSS is that actually when we were going through discovery and see what we need to do to get to compliance, there was a database with dubious security posture. And I'm not going to say it had a default password, but it may have had one. And there were parts like I follow very closely the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm working in my Zero Trust certification, which I think today, like Zero Trust is probably one of the big things we have in terms of security posture and how to mature like organizations, right? And many enterprises are doing that. In our company, we have Cloud for Zero Trust and Warp from day one, even though we're 3 people. But we like to take it that way. So what do we do in Allen Giraffe? And this is not a conversation about Allen Giraffe. It's not going to be a talk about Allen Giraffe, but we enable companies with less privileged data access for the modern stack. And it's an intersection of what you can see and the benefits of data vaults, privileged access management, and proxies. So let's dive into why we're here today. How many of you have heard of MCP? Okay, only a couple haven't heard of MCP. Okay, I think they're lying. But so yeah, we're all well familiar with what's going on with MCP, how many MCPs are out there. Like you can have 20 MCPs for the same thing. Something that we're not talking that much about is like on the security side of things. And they're like very lightweight security that people are starting to implement. And we're thinking about security in the same way of identity access management, right? Identity for these agents. And I don't think we're really conscious of what could be happening downstream, as well as other type of problems that we have. Mentioning again on the Cloud Security Alliance for this. So there's a very interesting conversation going on the threats and the security adoption for enterprises for MCP. Topics that people had brought on is, for example, if it could be mapped to the OWASP 10, something that I really could happen is that it needs to be its own OWASP 10 for MCPs, because we're going to see probably a different type of attacks. So what happens with the supply chain attacks, right? What happens if you're installing MCP, which is you want to have just a funny LLM talking to you about the weather and how the weather is going to be tomorrow, but then start sending some data from your laptop to someone else. Same about if you think about prompt injection, tool ingestion, sampling on the process of having an MCP using an LLM to complete whatever you ask for. And the other thing here is that in many scenarios, and what we see out there, and when we're talking to our design partners with the company, is they're mostly thinking about MCP for data access. And that is part of the problem we want to solve. But a lot of the conversation is around MCP for tooling in terms of access to terminal, access to browsers. I don't think it's going that deep, and it doesn't apply in the same security posture that you have, for example, with traditional API, which you could probably map a lot of them to an MCP. One of the key things that I think is going to start like ramping up with the MCP is the problem of the confused deputy, if you're familiar with it. So it's a computer program that is tricked by another program into misusing its authority on the system. Something that everyone probably is familiar with is the cross-site scripting, which is a confused deputy problem. And nowadays, with the frameworks on the web, it's not that much of an issue. It's not even on the OWASP 10 anymore. I think last time it was mentioned, it was maybe 2018 or 2017. But it's pretty much a problem that is solved. If you think about MCP, if you think about cross MCP scripting, you could be thinking about how an MCP is going to be ingesting into your laptop, into your servers, different commands that could be very harmful, and how you can control those type of things, right? Because you're not looking at deterministic inputs, right? And you're not looking at very concrete use cases. So we're going to bring something else here, which is another confused deputy problem on SQL ingestion, which this is very old. This is, I don't know, a 20-year-old problem that we completely forgot about. We use ORMs, right? We use the right framework, so we don't have to be thinking even about this type of issues. But now you see people saying, oh, we have our Postgres MCP. Supabase, they have a very big issue with data leak based on their MCP and granting too much permissions. I've used Low myself with Supabase and with their MCP to be able to set up some things, create schemas, and then the permissions were like overly permissive for whatever I was trying to do. And you always need to go back and check manually what's really going on. So it starts to get like pretty scary onto how this advance in technology is actually moving us back in security, right? In security around the data, which we know today that data is being more and more important, where it's not just we care about PII only, we care about PHI only, or credit card numbers. So that's the other part. So stopping about MCP, I'm not going to keep beating on it for now, just in a minute. We're going to talk about the top threats. So we need to look back a little bit of what happened last year and the year before, and what are the key threats that were just out there, right? The name of these companies, these are not small companies. These are not startups. They have a lot of manpower and a lot of technology to implement their security posture, right? But they still were victim of like very big data leaks. And in some cases, for example, if you look at Microsoft, it was just test credentials that were brute forced to be able to gain access, right? Then Snowflake, OMFA, 2024. That sounds a little bit crazy. Toyota, leakage of environment details, FTX, and the just stealing money from it, right? Football Australia, AM credentials. So what's the trend here? The trend is these are all credential and standing permissions attacks. So something that I really like to do, and I like to do is with my teams too, is there's a point in time that just making increments of value on a problem is just not going to cut it. You need to stop, you need to think back, and you need to start from scratch and probably try to leapfrog the problem, right? So how can we go through leapfrogging the problem? I think MFA is one of those use cases where we're going through 20 years ago, a password for your bank account that needs to be just 4 numbers. That was okay. Now we need to add letters. Now we need to add special characters. Now you need to change the password every 30 days. And at some point, it's like, this is just not enough. And someone thought about MFA and then the evolution of MFA from text to like the authenticators and so on and passkeys, right? So what are we going to do as an industry? And this is a conversation that we as Ellen Giraffe, again, yes, that's our name, we want to bring into industry. And something else that this was released today, this morning, there are hackers claiming a ransom for 1 billion records on Salesforce. There was one data leak that happened, I think a month ago or a few weeks ago. This is different. This is a new one. And this is not as much on, let's say, just credentials. This is more social engineer type of attack. But it's in the same way if you think about the intent of the data access, right? So that's the key thing. What are we proposing? What do we think is a leapfrogging of the problem when we're talking about data access, credentials, permissioning? So the organizations are moving into zero trust. We're seeing enterprises doing that. Probably companies that you work for, you have some sort of zero trust. Generally, what this means is they are moving their traditional VPNs and connections from accessing through the perimeter and then saying you're safe to communicate with whatever systems are inside the perimeter to just using SDP, software defined perimeter. The thing with this is that this is only analog to a VPN. But when we're talking about data, zero trust today actually defines a database or a server as a resource. And we think that's wrong. We think that actually you need to define each record and each property of that record as a resource, because actually my birthday or my social security number is a resource. It's not that the table that contains my data a resource, neither the server that contains my data and someone else's data the resource. So how can we implement something that is secure enough and enables us to treat each of these properties and each of these records as a resource? And for us, the answer is a data enclave, or as we put it, data containers for AI, but it could be not for AI, right? If I don't put AI on the talk, I'm afraid no one's gonna be here. So the data enclaves, they house a subset of sensitive data with compute, with storage, and with the networking resources. The other component of this associated to zero trust is that when you use something called SPA, single package authorization, is that you're not going to be able to see anything else, right? When you connect to let's say you connect to a database, you connect to a Postgres with read-only credentials, you're going to be able to see the rest of the tables, right? You're not going to be able to do inserts or anything like that. That's fine. But you still have access to, and you can see all the resources. Even if for that use case, you're not, and you shouldn't be accessing, I don't know, the users tables if you're just running a count of the number of orders, or if you want to calculate how much someone needs to pay at the end of the month for that subscription. So that's something that we think it needs to change. A connection string should not be sufficient enough, or should not be sufficient today to say we're going to authorize someone's access to a data set. We want to add context and we want to add segmentation to that specific connection. And how we can do that, that's why we mentioned data contracts. So data contracts, and we're going to see our opinionated implementation of this. Data contracts needs to tell you which users and applications are actually wanted to access that data. What data in the sense of, do you need the first name and last name, or do you just need the first name from that table to be able to access it? Or do you need only one of the records of the user's table? For how long? Do you really need to access this for 3 months or forever? Or do you just need this for the next 100 milliseconds or 1 hour? If you're doing, for example, customer support and you need to understand something's going on with a user, right? So you're thinking about just-in-time access. And the other part is the business purpose. Because if you don't have a purpose for accessing the data, then why do you really are going to access the data? So this is, I don't think you can properly see it. Let me see if I can do this. This is better. Yeah. Okay. A little bit. So here we have, like, this is our definition of it, where you have a description, you have a requester, you have the time it was created, you have the duration on how long do I want to access this, risk level, which is also useful. So when you think about these type of things and you think about security, and this is part of the zero trust principles too, it's useless if everything adds more friction, right? People are going to look ways to not actually have to go through that. So you need to find a way to properly automate everything for the process to be fast. So if you have a risk level, you can implement some policies that, okay, anything that is medium risk level or lower, we can auto-approve those. And maybe you don't need a human to be involved in that, or maybe you don't need all the systems to be involved in that, as well as the data access. And here the example is, okay, I want to access the financial database. the financial database, and then the account type and the account status, and then you have a filter per customer ID. Same way with Snowflake production, the data set customer data, you access first name and email, and you only want emails from like company 20, right? So this goes in that direction that we're talking about. All right. So why a data enclave and not a proxy? So some of the things we mentioned before, as a company, right, this intersection of both privileged access management and proxies. Proxies are good for some use cases. They will add a tiny bit of latency. It will be a single point of failure, but it could be good in certain scenarios. The key thing that we're thinking about, and if we take out the example of the Salesforce news of today, is you can still enable lateral movement. If you reverse engineer a proxy, if you reverse engineer their regular expressions or the implementation, you're going to be able to navigate through more of the data that you actually want. So they are inherently connected to the entire data sets and resources, which makes it a bit more risky than a data enclave, which we're going to go a little bit through the implementation after. They don't have the right level of isolation, and they don't comply with the same zero trust definition that you actually don't need to see the resources that you're not enabled to see. So how do we implement a data enclave? This is going to be very simple, much more simple than what you think. So man traps on jewelry stores, right? You need to close one door to be able to open the other. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck there. Data enclave should work in the same way. And they should have atomic operations from the moment that they're pulling the data out, from the moment that they're actually enabling access. A data enclave should receive, you can use a data contract. And here we're talking about high level concept of how you can implement this, but you don't need to follow exactly what we're saying. But imagine they receive a data contract with the context of, hey, I want these specific data sets. From those data sets, I want these specific columns, and with the filter of these specific rows. So we're only going to pull that data. And the gateway is not connected to a data enclave until that happens. And then the connection from the data enclave is severed from the resources. So if someone is smart enough to reverse engineer or to social engineer someone that has access to these data enclaves, they're going to have a struggle because, yes, they're going to be able to get some information, but never all of that information, even if the authentication device is compromised. So this goes with one of the zero trust principles of assumed breach. So that is our, let's say, opinionated view of today's world and how you can, for example, implement data access and security for your MCPs. Something that we did today is that we launched SpotDB, which is an open source package. This is using DuckDB, is built on Golang, and you can start implementing a little bit of what we just talked about on data enclaves. This is very simple. You just push a CSV, you open up a Docker container or a process in your laptop, in your server. If you don't want to run it in a container, you can run it however you want, but you just push a CSV or how many CSVs you want to it. You operate on it, you do all the transformations you want to do, you do all the analysis you want, and then you shut it down and it's gone. Or you can also take a snapshot if you want to resume that workload after. So it's very useful for data analysis or agentic workflows. And this is actually the URL to our ProHow launch, which we'll really appreciate if you go there and you give a thumbs up. So yeah, that's so. And this is a joke we had about LLMs and popsicles and toddlers that they always want more data. And I'm very afraid of letting an LLM loose within my data. I've been victim of just asking Cloud to do one thing and then trying to revamp my entire code base. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. And any questions, if anyone has any questions. I guess I was very convincing. All right. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah, I was wondering what the use cases for SpotDB were that you listed there at the end.
Is you think about data analysis, or if you think about specifically data enclave, right? If you are, let's say that you are customer support person and you need to understand what's going on with someone's orders, right? You can have a system orchestrating of pulling those orders, pushing them to SpotDB, and then giving access to a chatbot agent to that specific instance of SpotDB. And then it's going to be able to analyze and calculate and create new data sets based on that and get the summary to the person.